She was sitting alone on the far end of the platform. Most folks didn't even notice her. Some assumed she was waiting for a train that wouldn't come. A few young ones whispered that she looked like one of those widows who talked to ghosts. But he saw her. He really saw her. Thomas Ridge had just stepped off the southbound train, boots heavy with dust and a week's worth of miles behind him. He wasn't supposed to notice anyone, not in this town, not today. He was only stopping to change lines, maybe get a cup of bitter coffee from the station's half-broken stand. But there she was, still, quiet, forgotten. There was something about the way she held her hands in her lap, how still she sat. The world rushed past her, children laughing too loud, a porter calling out destinations. But she stayed in her place like a statue no one wanted anymore. The strange part wasn't that she looked alone. It was that she looked like she'd been that way for years, not minutes. Like she didn't expect anyone to remember her name. Thomas had known what it felt like to be overlooked, ignored, left behind. That was before the war, before the wound in his leg changed the way he walked, the way people looked at him. After that, he'd learned how easily folks forgot the people who didn't move quick enough, didn't talk loud enough. Maybe that's why he crossed the platform and stopped in front of her. She looked up, not startled, just curious, like she hadn't expected a soul to speak to her ever again. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, adjusting the brim of his hat. She blinked slowly. "Do I look all right?" He didn't answer right away. Her voice was deep and dry, with a bitter edge like someone who'd spent too much time alone. She wasn't young, that was true. The skin around her eyes folded like soft creases in linen. But she wasn't old either. Not the kind that came with a cane and clouded memory. Her eyes were sharp, too sharp for a woman no one seemed to see. "You look like you've been waiting a while," Thomas said. She gave the barest smile. 17 years. He sat beside her without thinking. Not close. Just enough that she didn't have to raise her voice to talk. He didn't know why he believed her. 17 years? Who waits that long at a station? But something in the way she said it made his chest tighten. Like maybe it wasn't the train she was waiting for. "My name's Thomas Ridge," he said. She looked at him as if that name tugged at something she didn't want to remember. "You don't look like your father." He went still. That was a name he hadn't heard in years. He wasn't a Ridge to most folks. Just Thomas. Nobody cared who his father was anymore, and that suited him fine. "You knew him." The woman's gaze slid down to her lap. "We all knew him. Back then." A silence settled between them, heavy as the summer air. The train hissed in the background, engines humming like a memory coming too close. She folded her hands tighter. "I was called Mabel," she said at last. Mabel Hart. It hit him hard. Not because he remembered her, but because his father's journals, stacked in an old chest back at the house, had a name scribbled again and again in the margins. M.H. Sometimes May. Sometimes Hart. Always followed by words crossed out, whole lines erased. And now here she was, real and silent on a bench no one else dared sit on. "I think he wrote about you," Thomas said carefully. Mabel's lips pressed into a line. Then he lied. He didn't know what to say. The heat pressed in closer, even as a breeze whipped dust across the platform. He waited. "I was 16 when he promised to take me away," she said finally. "Said we'd go west. Said he'd marry me. But he never came back. I stayed here. Every day. Every week. Every damn year." Her voice didn't shake. That was what made it worse. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't even angry. Not the way some women shouted in the street when things broke apart. No, this was the kind of wound that sank too deep to bleed. Thomas shifted, guilt crawling up his throat like he was the one who did it. "My father wasn't an honest man." She laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "He was charming." That's worse. They sat in silence for a while, letting the sounds of the station pass them by. People came and went. Nobody looked at them. "Why stay?" he asked softly. 17 years is a long time to wait. Her eyes met his. Because someone had to remember. It struck him then that maybe she wasn't mad. Maybe she was just determined. She'd refused to let go of the past. Not out of weakness, but because if she did, it would vanish completely. She had nothing else left. No husband, no children, no home anyone welcomed her into. Just this story she kept alive by staying here where it ended. He didn't know why it mattered so much. Maybe it was the way his father died, with nothing but a flask and a bad name left behind. Maybe it was that Mabel had waited longer than anyone deserved to. I think he meant to come back, Thomas said. Then he should have, she said. I would have forgiven him. I would have walked into the fire with him. But he didn't come. He ran. He always ran. Thomas didn't try to defend him again. He didn't even know what kind of man his father really was. Mabel did. And for some reason, she'd chosen not to curse him out loud, not to throw her pain at anyone's feet. She'd chosen to remember him with stillness, not rage. That takes a kind of strength most people can't name. When the station quieted and the sun dropped lower in the sky, she stood. "Where will you go?" he asked. Mabel didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I'm tired of being remembered only by the ghosts." He stood too, his knees stiff from sitting. "Would you come with me?" She looked at him sideways. "Why?" He shrugged. "Because no one should be forgotten." Mabel Hart looked at him for a long time, her eyes filled with years of stories no one had listened to. And then, without a word, she nodded. They left the station together, a man with a limp and a woman who had waited too long. Behind them, the bench sat empty for the first time in 17 years. The town of Dry Creek wasn't on most maps anymore. It had shrunk to nothing over the years, left behind by the railroad and forgotten by everyone who didn't have roots sunk deep into its dry soil. But to Mabel Hart, it was still the center of everything that had gone wrong. Once, she'd danced barefoot in wheat fields just outside the town limits, laughing with a ribbon in her hair. She'd been young and bold and too quick to believe a boy who promised her the world with a crooked smile and a flask tucked into his vest. That boy was Nathaniel Ridge, Thomas's father, and when he vanished, he took her future with him. Thomas followed Mabel through the dusty streets, unsure if he was walking with a broken woman or someone who had carried too much strength alone. He didn't ask questions. He figured she'd speak when she wanted to. When they reached the edge of town, where a collapsed chapel leaned sideways like it had been drinking, she paused and looked toward the hills. "That's where my father buried my brother," she said. "After the accident." He didn't ask which accident. It wasn't his place. But the way she said it made his stomach twist. The place was full of memories no one had swept away, and she'd carried them all on her back like a mule. They passed a group of boys tossing rocks into a rusted water tank. One of them stopped, wide-eyed, when he saw her. "Ain't that the widow witch?" he whispered to his friend. Thomas turned on them with a sharp glare. "She's got a name." The boy turned red and looked away. Mabel just kept walking, her back straight, like she'd heard it all before. At the edge of town, just past the cemetery gate, stood a small shack leaning against a patch of dying trees. The roof had a hole in it, and a single lantern hung by the door. "This is where I sleep," Mabel said. "Most nights." Thomas looked around. "You live here?" She nodded. "Then let me stay, as long as I don't bother anyone." He didn't know who they were, but it made him angry. A woman who had done nothing but wait, who had harmed no one, reduced to a tool shed with a cot inside. He didn't say anything. He just stepped inside, ducking under the frame. There was barely room to turn around, and yet everything inside was spotless. A worn quilt, a tiny mirror with a cracked corner, a folded letter pressed between the pages of Bible. That night, Mabel finally told him everything. Nathaniel Ridge had rolled into Dry Creek on a borrowed horse. Said he was headed west, just passing through. He was 17, fast-talking, quick-witted, and beautiful in the way only liars could be. Mabel's family had just buried her brother, and she was raw, looking for something to cling to. He saw that, took advantage of it. He said, "I made the world feel quiet," she whispered. He'd say that when we'd sit under the old windmill. Said I calmed the storm inside him. She believed him. Of course she had. He made her feel like she mattered. And back then, in a house with a grieving father and a silent mother, being noticed felt like a kind of salvation. But it was short-lived. He left her in the night with a note that said, I'll send for you, and nothing else. He never did. She waited through the spring, then summer, then 17 years, waiting for her lover Nathaniel Ridge, who had promised her marriage and a new life before leaving her behind. Long after the shame faded and the whispers turned into silence, folks around town stopped asking about her. Most forgot what had happened. Some just called her odd. Some meaner folks called her worse. Thomas listened without interrupting, his hands clenched in his lap. He hated his father in that moment, not just for what he'd done to her, but for never telling the truth. Nathaniel had returned home eventually, married a banker's daughter, raised 2 sons. Thomas had grown up thinking his father was just a quiet man who didn't talk about the war. But now he saw him for what he truly was, a coward who'd left behind damage too deep to fix. Later, they went into town for supplies. That's when they met Ida Lynn, a short, gray-haired woman who ran the general store with an iron grip. She looked surprised to see Mabel with someone. "Well, I'll be," Ida said, squinting over her spectacles. "You found a friend, Mabel." Mabel didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. Thomas nodded. "Just passing through. She's been kind to me." Ida didn't miss a beat. Kind? That's one word for it. She used to be the best singer this town ever heard. Did you know that? Mabel shifted her weight uncomfortably. "Used to sing at the chapel," Ida went on. "Before it fell. Before the town fell. Before, well, before everything." Thomas bought coffee, bread, and tobacco, though he didn't smoke. Ida wrapped them neatly, then looked Mabel in the eye. "You don't have to stay at the edge of town, you know," she said softly. "I do," Mabel replied, just as softly, "because they won't forget if I leave." That night, thunder rolled over the horizon. A storm brewed, and Thomas watched her from the doorway as she stood outside in the rain, staring at the hills. "You ever tried to leave?" he asked. "Where would I go?" she said without turning. He didn't answer. He didn't know either. The next day, something shifted. A man named Sheriff Boyd came to see them. Stocky, with a silver badge and eyes like burnt leather. He had history with Mabel. Everyone did, but his tone was different. "You planning to stay, Ridge?" he asked Thomas, arms crossed. "Don't know," Thomas replied honestly. Boyd gave a slow nod. "This town don't forgive easy. We don't forget either." He wasn't threatening. Not exactly, but it was clear. Mabel had been marked a long time ago, and Thomas, by sitting next to her, by listening to her, was starting to carry that same weight. Later that week, they went to the chapel ruins. Just the two of them. She showed him the broken pews, the old altar, and the place where she used to stand and sing. "They used to say my voice made the babies stop crying," she said with a sad smile. "Why'd you stop?" "Because one day, no one asked me to sing anymore." And just like that, the silence came back. That evening, Thomas pulled out his father's journal from his pack. He read the entries aloud, bits and pieces that mentioned a girl with fire in her hands, a girl who smelled like wind and wildflowers. One passage said, "If I ever go back, I'll marry her. But I won't go back. I can't face her eyes." Mabel listened quietly, then said, "He wasn't wrong. I would have burned him alive with just a look." They both laughed, but it wasn't happy. It was a laugh to hold back all the years that felt like wasted time. And so the tension deepened, not just between them and the town, but between Mabel and the life she might have had. Between Thomas and the man whose blood ran through his veins, and what that meant. The people of Dry Creek whispered again, just like old times. They didn't like ghosts coming back. They didn't like the past being pulled into the light. But neither Mabel nor dances, nor Thomas seemed to care. For the first time in a long while, Mabel wasn't invisible. And Thomas? He was beginning to feel like maybe he had a purpose that went beyond drifting from place to place. They had no plan yet, no destination. But something had started that couldn't be undone. The truth was stirring. And truth, in a town that buried things deep, had a way of making everything crack wide open. The days that followed were slow, but not in a bad way. They unfolded like warm sunlight on cold skin, quiet, cautious, and a little strange at first. Thomas didn't mean to stay in Dry Creek. He wasn't the kind of man who stayed anywhere long. But something about the way Mabel moved through the world, half invisible and yet so sharply aware, kept him there. She never asked him to help, never hinted that she wanted company. But she didn't turn him away either. And that was enough. They developed a rhythm. In the mornings, Thomas would walk down to the well at the far end of town and carry back water from Mabel's shack. She didn't ask him to. He just hated the thought of her walking that far with a tin bucket alone. She never thanked him aloud, but one morning he found a jar of honey biscuits wrapped in cloth beside his bedroll. She didn't need to say it. He understood. They talked in pieces, never too much at once. Thomas told her about his childhood in New Mexico, about how his mother had died young and his father had never quite forgiven the world afterward. He talked about the war, but only in short bursts, enough to show her he'd seen things, enough to let her know his limp wasn't the worst of it. Mabel shared stories like seeds, letting them fall one by one. A memory of her mother's laugh, a song her brother used to hum when it rained. The way the wind sounded in Dry Creek before the town lost its soul. And slowly, a picture of her began to take shape. Not just the woman who waited, but the girl she had once been. Curious, brave, full of songs and stubbornness. One evening, after a quiet supper of boiled potatoes and dried beef, Thomas pulled out a little pocket harmonica. It was scratched and dented, but still sang when he blew into it. "You play?" she asked, eyebrow raised. "Badly," he admitted. He gave it a few slow notes, fumbling through a clumsy tune. To his surprise, Mabel chuckled. Actually chuckled. It was the first real sound of joy he'd heard from her, and it caught him off guard. She shook her head. "You sound like a mule learning to yawn." He grinned. "That bad. Worse." But later, after the stars came out and the fire died down to a glow, she hummed the rest of the song he'd tried to play. Her voice was soft, not strong like it might have once been, but it still held something steady and true. It made the hair on the back of his neck rise. She looked embarrassed when she finished. "See," he said, "you still got it." She waved him off, but her cheeks flushed. A little light returned to her face. It wasn't much, but it was something. They started working together the next day. Thomas couldn't stand the state of her shack, and she didn't argue when he offered to patch the roof. He found old boards in a collapsed barn and spent 2 days sawing, hammering, and cursing under his breath while she held the ladder steady. It wasn't just about fixing things. It was about giving her something back. A roof that didn't leak. A door that closed all the way. A place that felt less like a punishment and more like a home. In return, she taught him how to make nettle tea and how to thread a needle so it wouldn't tangle. She made him scrub his boots before entering the shack and scolded him for leaving tools out overnight. He didn't mind. Her voice had stopped sounding hollow. It had weight now, like it belonged here again. Word started to spread in town that Thomas Ridge was fixing up the widow's place. Some folks frowned. Others shrugged. One man spat near his boots outside the store. But Ida Lynn smiled wider each time he came in. She started slipping extra coffee into his parcels. Once she whispered, "She ain't laughed in years, you know. Until you." He didn't know what to say to that. Sheriff Boyd stopped by one afternoon, hands on his belt, eyes hard as ever. "You think you're fixing her?" he asked. Thomas leaned on the porch post, wiping sweat from his brow. "No," he said, "just giving her a hand." Boyd studied him for a long minute. "She was ruined, you know. People gave up on her." Thomas shrugged. Maybe people shouldn't have. Boyd didn't argue, just nodded once and walked away. The days got warmer. The nights smelled like sage and wood smoke. And in the stillness of each evening, the air between them shifted. Mabel would sit closer to him now. Sometimes she'd hand him something without asking, like she already knew he needed it. One night, he brushed her fingers by accident, and she didn't pull away. Neither did he. He found an old fiddle in the back of the church ruins. Its strings were brittle, the bow almost useless. He spent days restringing it, tuning it, making it playable again. He didn't know why, not at first. Maybe because she deserved something beautiful. Maybe because he needed something to believe in. When he handed it to her, she stared at it like it was something sacred. "I haven't touched one of these since I was a girl," she whispered. "Then it's about damn time," he said gently. That night, she played. Not a full song, not anything perfect. Just a few slow notes that danced into the air like smoke. Thomas sat and listened, the fire warm on his hands, the stars wide above them. And for a little while, nothing hurt. The war was far away. Her pain was far away. There was only music and night and the strange, quiet comfort that had bloomed between them. Mabel started walking into town again, not hiding at the edges, but walking down the center road with her shoulders back. People looked. Some nodded. Some didn't. She didn't care. Thomas walked beside her. He didn't say anything. He just matched her pace and carried the basket. Ida Lynn began inviting them to supper. The first time, Mabel almost said no. But Thomas touched her hand under the table and she agreed. Over stew and cornbread, she laughed twice. Ida smiled like she might cry. One afternoon, Mabel showed Thomas an old trunk under her cot. Inside were dresses wrapped in linen, a silver hairpin, and a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. "He never wrote back," she said, "but I kept mine anyway." He read one. Just one. It was full of hope, full of plans, full of a young woman who believed in forever. "I was someone else when I wrote those," she said. "You're still her," he said. "She's just quieter now." Mabel looked at him long and hard, then nodded, like maybe, just maybe, she believed it. Spring came slow but sure. Wildflowers bloomed where the ground had cracked. Birds returned to the dry trees, and the town began to shift. It was in the little things, a boy waving at Mabel as she passed, someone setting a pie on the porch and walking away before she could say thank you. Not everyone changed. Some never would, but a few did, enough to notice. One day, while digging a small garden patch behind the shack, Thomas asked her, "You ever think about leaving?" She stood with her hands on her hips, looking at the horizon. "I used to think if I left, the past would chase me down. Now I think maybe I don't need to run from it. Maybe I can just walk somewhere new." He smiled. "Well, when you're ready, I'll walk with you." Mabel didn't answer, just wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. It wasn't a love story in the way people expected. There were no fireworks, no stolen kisses in the dark. It was built slow, steady, brick by brick, like a house they hadn't realized they were building. But it was real. It was kind. And it was healing. She gave him a place to rest. He gave her a reason to rise. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both knew something big was coming. Something that would test what they'd built. But for now, in those days of rebuilding and remembering, hope lived between them like a candle finally lit after years of darkness. And they weren't ready to let it go out. Thomas woke before the sun most days, listening to the soft sounds of Mabel breathing across the room. She slept lighter now, but not peaceful. Her dreams twisted under her eyelids. And sometimes she'd mutter things that made him sit up in the dark, heart tight with the knowing that there were places inside her he couldn't reach. Rooms locked so long they had dust in the air. The work around the shack continued, but not with the same quiet warmth they'd come to know. Something had shifted between them. Not broken, just uncertain. Mabel had grown used to his presence, and maybe that frightened her more than being alone ever did. He saw it in the way she hesitated when he touched her shoulder, the way she turned away just a little quicker when he tried to catch her eyes. She was pulling inward, folding herself back into the silence she had lived in for nearly 2 decades. Thomas didn't push. He waited, but it gnawed at him. Each quiet moment that used to feel like safety now felt like distance. It came to a head on a hot afternoon when they were mending the fence behind the shack. Thomas drove a post into the dry earth, sweat rolling down his back. And when he turned to ask Mabel to hand him the wire spool, she wasn't looking at him. She was staring across the field, eyes fixed on something invisible, her hand clenched around the wire until her knuckles turned white. "You all right?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She blinked. "What? You drifted off." I'm fine. She dropped the wire and turned, heading for the water jug. But Thomas followed. You're not. You've been pulling away. Mabel froze with the dipper halfway to her lips. She didn't drink, just stared at the trees. You don't understand, she said. Then tell me. Her breath caught, like she hadn't meant to say anything more, but it tumbled out anyway. I've already lived through losing someone once. I don't know if I can live through it again. Thomas's heart sank. You think I'm going to leave? Why wouldn't you? She whispered. Everyone else did. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. I don't want to need someone, Thomas, she said, her voice shaking now. Needing someone feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. Every step forward could be the one that kills you. He didn't try to argue. He couldn't, because part of him understood. He'd felt that same edge when she smiled at him, when she let him close. Because caring meant losing, and losing meant pain. And they'd both had enough pain to last 2 lifetimes. The days after that were strained. Mabel spoke less, kept herself busy with things that didn't need doing, rearranging shelves, sweeping dirt floors twice over, scrubbing the same pot until her hands ached. Thomas spent more time in town, mostly alone. Even Ida Lynn noticed. She's gone quiet again, Ida said, handing him a parcel of beans and flour. She's scared, Thomas replied, staring at the floor. Aren't we all? Ida said gently. One evening, Thomas found Mabel on the chapel steps. She hadn't lit a lantern. She was sitting in the dark, looking up at the broken bell tower. You want to leave? She said before he could speak. No, he said quickly, but I don't know how to stay if you won't let me. She turned her face toward him, eyes glassy in the moonlight. What if I'm not who you think I am? You're not, he said. You're more. She shook her head, angry now. You don't know what I did after you left. You don't know what I became. He stepped forward slowly. Then tell me. So she did, piece by piece. She told him about the baby she lost the winter after Nathaniel disappeared. About the way her father drank himself to death in silence. About how the townsfolk whispered when she passed. About the nights she wandered the fields screaming into the sky because it was the only way to survive. She told him she had considered walking into the river more than once. That the only reason she didn't was because something in her kept hoping maybe someone would come back. I was angry, she said. Angry at him. At God. At myself. I cursed this town. I cursed everyone in it. I even cursed the child I lost. Thomas knelt beside her, holding her hand even when she tried to pull it away. You think I'll see you different now, he said. But I don't. You've been through hell and you're still here. That's not weakness, Mabel. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen. She cried then. Not loud, not pretty, just slow tears down a face that had held too much for too long. Thomas didn't speak. He just held her hand tighter and let her cry. But pain doesn't disappear after one confession. And fear doesn't vanish with a single touch. They tried to move forward, but something lingered in the air, like the feeling before a storm. The townspeople had begun talking again. Some kinder, some not. A man named Ellis Harper, whose father once courted Mabel's mother, started spreading stories at the saloon, half-truths twisted to sound like gospel. She kept that child in secret. He told anyone who'd listen. Some say she buried it out by the old cottonwood tree. The rumors spread like brush fire. Mabel didn't say anything, but Thomas saw the way her shoulders hunched again when they walked through town. The way her eyes scanned the faces of old women and young men with equal dread. One night, a rock hit the side of her shack. Thomas rushed outside to find no one, only laughter disappearing into the trees. The next morning, someone scratched which into the side of her garden fence. I should have left years ago, she said, standing in front of it. Thomas grabbed a piece of wood and hammered a new board over it. You're not going anywhere. But doubt had crept back into her bones. Then came the letter, delivered by Sheriff Boyd, quiet as always. He handed it to Thomas, said, You might want to read this first, and left. It was from Thomas's older brother, Calvin Ridge, the golden son, the one who'd inherited the land and stayed clean while Thomas went to war. The The letter was sharp and to the point. Father spoke of Dry Creek before he died. Said he made a mistake there. Said there was a woman he never forgave himself for. Said you'd understand when you found her. But I think you've stayed long enough. Come home. There's work here. A future. Don't waste your life on a ghost. Thomas didn't show the letter to Mabel. Not yet. He didn't want her to read the word ghost. But Mabel found it later that week, folded under his shirt in his bedroll. He came back to find her standing there, letter in hand, jaw clenched. "So, I'm a ghost now?" she said. He stepped forward. "That's not what I think. It's what your family thinks. It's what this town thinks. Maybe it's what I've become. Don't say that." She threw the letter down. Go. Go back to the land. To the people who still believe in you. I'll be fine." "No," he said, louder than he meant to. "You won't. And neither will I." They stood there, both breathing hard, both terrified for different reasons. Thomas stepped closer. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. You're not a ghost. You're the most alive thing I've ever known. But if you keep pushing me away every time it gets hard, every time you get scared, then maybe I can't stay. Not because I don't want to, but because you won't let me." Mabel's face cracked. Not visibly, not in any way the town would notice. But Thomas saw it. She was breaking apart again. He left that night. Only walked as far as Ida's, but he didn't tell Mabel that. Ida didn't ask questions. She just gave him a spare cot and a cup of tea. "She's scared of loving you," Ida said quietly. "But she's more scared of losing you." Thomas lay awake all night. The next morning, he returned. Mabel was sitting in the garden, near the scratched fence. "You didn't go far," she said, not looking up. "No," he replied. "Didn't feel right." She sighed. "I don't know how to stop being afraid." "Then we'll be afraid together," he said. "And maybe we'll get braver a little at a time." She looked up at him, eyes tired but softer. "I'm not a whole person," she said. "You don't have to be," he replied. "Neither am I." For the first time, she let him hold her in broad daylight, in full view of the world. And though the fence still bore the mark, though the town still whispered, though fear still curled at the edges of every joy, they stayed. Because leaving was easy, but staying together, broken and healing in the same breath, that was the bravest thing either of them had ever done. The morning it happened, the sky was heavy, low with gray clouds that refused to break. The kind of weather that presses on your chest before you even step outside. Mabel had been restless all night, pacing the shack long after Thomas had fallen asleep. She kept glancing at the small mirror above the wash basin, touching her hair, wiping her palms on her dress. Something was coming. He could feel it in her silence, in the way her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't watching. "I think I need to go there," she finally said over breakfast, barely touching her bread. "Where?" he asked, though part of him already knew. The cottonwood tree. It was the place no one talked about. The spot Ellis Harper had gossiped about like it was a cursed landmark. Mabel had never taken Thomas there, never spoken of it directly. But now she was looking at him, not with fear, at least not the kind that makes a person run. This fear was different. It was the kind that makes a person stay rooted in place, even when everything inside begs to flee. He didn't ask questions. He just packed water, wrapped leftover biscuits, and walked beside her down the narrow path behind the fields. Neither of them spoke as the trees swallowed the light and the dry air turned cooler under the shade. The wind was barely there, but enough to make the tall grass whisper. It felt like stepping into a memory. The cottonwood stood alone at the bottom of a shallow hill, its branches reaching like old arms into the gray sky. The earth beneath, it was uneven, the kind of ground shaped by weather and time. Mabel stopped several paces away, hands clenched in front of her. "I buried her here," she said, her voice barely louder than the wind. "My daughter." Thomas froze. He had suspected it deeply, but hearing it, feeling it in the air, was something else entirely. "She was born too early," Mabel said slowly. "I was 17. I didn't even tell anyone I was with child. I hid it with coats and quiet. I thought maybe if I kept her a secret, he'd come back before anyone found out. that he'd come and say we'd leave and no one would need to know. She stepped closer to the tree, dropped to her knees. I went into labor alone. I was too scared to scream. She was tiny. She barely breathed for an hour. I wrapped her in my old church shawl and held her until she stopped moving. Then I dug. Thomas's chest tightened. "You were a child yourself." Mabel nodded, her eyes wet but calm. After that, I stopped singing, stopped praying. The people in town stopped looking at me like I belonged. I guess I stopped trying to make them. She reached out and touched the bark of the tree. "I haven't been back here in 15 years. Thomas knelt beside her. "Thank you for bringing me." She turned to look at him. "Why? Why would you want to carry this with me?" "Because you've been carrying it alone for too long." She looked down, hands resting in the dirt. I named her Hope. "Isn't that stupid?" "No," he whispered. "That's perfect." Mabel broke then, not like someone falling apart, but like someone finally exhaling after drowning for too long. She sobbed in her hands, face buried in her arms. And Thomas held her, said nothing, just let her cry everything she'd kept silent for all those years. When the sobs slowed, she whispered, "I thought I was cursed. I thought maybe God had taken her to punish me for loving the wrong man. I blamed myself." "You didn't deserve any of this," Thomas said. "Not the shame, not the silence, not the way they treated you." She leaned against him, her breathing uneven. "I want to forget this place." But the forgetting never worked. It always pulled at me. Every time I heard a child laugh, every time I saw a mother with her baby, it came back. And I hated myself for what I didn't get to have. "You survived," he said, gently brushing dirt from her skirt. "You raised yourself through hell, and you're still here." They stayed by the tree until the sun peeked through the clouds, sending pale light across the ground. Mabel stood and placed one hand over the roots. "I want to mark this place," she said. "So she's not just a memory anymore." Thomas nodded. "We'll build something. A stone, maybe. Something simple but lasting." When they returned to town, the change in Mabel was quiet but sure. Her shoulders sat straighter. Her eyes steadied when she met someone's gaze. She stopped flinching at every whisper because she had faced the worst of her past and made peace with it. But not everyone was ready to let the past rest. 2 nights later, Ellis Harper waited for them outside the general store. He was drunk, swaying a little, and bitter as spoiled wine. "You think you could just walk around like nothing happened?" He spat at Mabel. "You think people forget what you were?" Thomas stepped forward, but Mabel stopped him with a hand. "I don't need you to fight my battles," she said quietly, then turned to Ellis. "No, Ellis, I don't think people forget, but I think some of them change." He laughed, ugly and sharp. "Not this town." "Then maybe it's time the town changed." Ellis stared at her, stunned, and then shoved Thomas hard. "You don't belong here," he growled. "You're just another mistake like your father." Thomas didn't hit him. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked Ellis in the eye and said, "The difference is I didn't run." Ellis stepped back, hands shaking, then stormed off into the dark. The next morning, the townsfolk gathered near the chapel ruins, where Thomas and Mabel had placed a simple wooden cross under the old bell frame. They hadn't invited anyone. They just went, set the marker down, and stood there together. But Idolin showed up, then Boyd, then 2 others, then more. They didn't speak, just stood in a wide circle, heads bowed. Not everyone had forgiven. Not everyone would. But enough stood there in silence to show something was changing. That wounds, when exposed to light and time, could begin to heal. Later that day, Mabel found Thomas fixing the porch railing. She leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, but her face soft. "I never thought I'd feel anything like this again," she said. "What's that?" "Peace." He smiled at her, brushing sawdust from his shirt. "It suits you." She stepped closer. "I'm still afraid. I probably always will be." "So will I," he said. "But if I asked you to stay," she whispered, "for good, would you?" Thomas set the hammer down slowly and stepped toward her. "I already did." She smiled, really smiled, wide and sure like sunlight on water. And she reached up, finally, to touch his face. I think Hope would have liked you, she said. I hope she would have. That night, they sat on the porch as dusk settled over Dry Creek. The wind carried the sound of crickets, the smell of earth. Mabel rested her head on his shoulder. Her hand found his, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them was holding back. Neither of them was running. They had faced what needed facing, named what had gone unnamed for too long. The shadows still lingered. Some wounds never disappear, but now they were living in the light. Not as broken people, but as survivors. Together. Spring turned to early summer in Dry Creek, and everything softened with the change. Light came earlier, the wind lost its edge, and the world felt quieter, somehow more forgiving. Mabel and Thomas had begun tending to the land behind her shack, planting rows of beans and squash, pulling weeds with dirt under their nails and sweat in their brows. They worked without speaking sometimes, like two halves of a clock moving in perfect rhythm. Other times, they talked about simple things, what the clouds looked like, how many fence posts still needed fixing, whether Torreale would ever build the school back up again. The heavy silences from before were gone now. What remained was stillness, the kind that feels like home. One morning, Thomas woke to find Mabel already outside, kneeling by the rows of green shoots. She had a ribbon tied around her braid and the sun on her face. He stood in the doorway for a while, watching her, something stirring in his chest that he didn't yet know how to say out loud. She looked up and saw him, gave a small smile, and in that moment he knew. Later that day, they walked into town together, hand in hand, not hiding, not afraid. It wasn't a big event. No one cheered, but people noticed. Ida Lynn gave Mabel a wink as she handed her a bag of flour. A boy who once called her names gave her a respectful nod. Even Sheriff Boyd tipped his hat with a grunt that almost sounded like approval. The town hadn't changed completely, but it had bent just enough to let them belong. They began rebuilding the old chapel together, not as a church, not as a shrine, but as a gathering place. It started small. Thomas fixed the roof beams. Mabel cleaned the windows. A few people dropped by to help, some with wood, some with nails, some just with their hands. It became a place for stories, for music, for laughter. The children came first, drawn by curiosity, then the women, then the rest. And just like that, the place where Mabel once stopped singing became a place where voices rose again. One afternoon, after hammering the last board into the chapel's porch, Thomas leaned back and looked at her. "What now?" he asked. Mabel tilted her head. "Now we build the rest of our lives." It wasn't a proposal, not exactly, but it was a promise. A quiet one, as all their most important words were. That evening, as the sun set low and gold behind the hills, they sat under the cottonwood tree. Mabel placed a small carved stone beneath the trunk, smooth, round, and etched with a single word: hope. She didn't cry this time. She didn't tremble. She simply sat with Thomas, her hand in his, while the breeze moved gently through the leaves. That night, they made love for the first time, not with desperation or fear, but with reverence. Slowly, like each touch was a way of learning one another from the inside out. There was no awkwardness, no shame, just two people, long starved of gentleness, rediscovering it in each other. She traced the scars on his shoulder like she was memorizing a story. He kissed the crease beside her mouth that deepened when she smiled. It was tender and honest, a soft joining of lives that had spent too long in the dark. When it was over, they lay tangled together, listening to the wind, the silence between them full of something holy. In the days that followed, the garden began to bloom. The squash stretched long and pale, the beans climbed, and the herbs filled the air with scent. Mabel made soup from the first harvest and brought it to town in a clay pot, placing it on Ida's counter with a quiet pride. Ida spooned some into a bowl and handed it to a young boy, smiling at Mabel like she was seeing her again for the first time. Thomas spent more time writing letters, something he never used to do. He wrote to his brother Calvin, telling him the truth. About their father, about the child left behind, about the woman who had been more than just a ghost. He didn't ask for understanding. He only wrote to be heard. Calvin's reply came 2 weeks later. I never knew any of this. I'm sorry. If there's anything I can do, say the word. Thomas didn't reply right away, but he kept the letter, folded it neat, and placed it beside Mabel's old ones. They didn't belong to the same time, but now they lived in the same space. The past and the future touching gently. One quiet morning, Mabel stood on the edge of town, staring at the old train station. Thomas came up beside her, taking her hand. You ever want to leave? She asked softly. Sometimes, he said, but not today. She nodded. Not today. There was peace in that answer. Not running, not waiting, just choosing to be still in a world that had never let them be still before. They never married in the traditional sense. No preacher, no crowd, no rings. But one afternoon, under the cottonwood tree, Mabel took a chain from her neck and placed it around Thomas's. On it was a small silver pendant, worn with time. It belonged to my mother, she said. Now it's yours. Thomas didn't need to say anything. His hand covered hers, and that was enough. The town slowly stopped calling her the widow witch or the ghost woman. Children started to visit the chapel more often. One girl asked if Mabel would teach her how to sing. She agreed. Her voice still cracked sometimes, but she sang anyway. Thomas built a bench beside the cottonwood tree. Some days, they sat there without speaking, just watching the breeze in the branches. Other days, they spoke of things they might do, travel a little, build a second room on the shack, adopt a stray dog from the saloon's backyard. They didn't need grand plans. They had each other. And for two people who had lost everything once, that was more than enough. In time, Mabel began to smile without thinking about it. The lines around her eyes softened. She started wearing the ribbon in her hair more often. She laughed when Thomas made terrible coffee and scolded him when he forgot to water the herbs. He would grin, kiss her cheek, and go do it. They had their days like anyone. Bad weather, sore backs, old fears that rose and hovered before fading again. But there was no more running, no more silence that cut deeper than words. One evening, they watched a storm roll in from the hills, the sky flashing pink and gold before the clouds turned dark. Mabel leaned against him and said, I think we're going to be all right. He kissed her temple. We already are. As the rain began to fall, they didn't move. They let it soak them, faces lifted toward the sky, hands clasped, letting the earth wash itself clean again. No one came to Dry Creek expecting miracles. But if someone had passed through that summer, they might have noticed the rebuilt chapel, the little garden blooming behind the shack, the laughter of children echoing in the valley. And if they looked closer, they'd see a woman who used to be forgotten walking side by side with a man who once believed he had no future. Both of them living proof that sometimes, after enough time, enough stillness, enough pain, love still finds a way to take root in even the driest land. And if that traveler stopped to ask how it all began, someone in town, maybe Ida, maybe Boyd, might simply point to the bench beneath the cottonwood tree, where two souls once met their past and walked quietly, finally, into the rest of their life.